Well, Sam, really good to have the opportunity to speak to you. Thanks very much for coming in to chat about your project. So I thought, just in terms of like a little introduction, it's probably worth me giving a little bit of context as to what the original idea was in asking you to work on this. So you've been working with us now over the last, well, kind of year to 18 months, I guess, on this project, which I organised as part of Arnolfini's 60th anniversary celebrations for 2021. And there was various different aspects to this, to the 60th projects. You know, looking back at various exhibitions or events that seemed particularly interesting or fruitful to kind of reconsider in the present. But this one, your project, has been all focused around the piece Somerset, A Year in the Life of a Field, by the artist Lizzie Cox. Now, all of the other artists and art projects that we looked at in through the 60th anniversary were all things that I knew a fair bit about. They were quite well represented in the archive. They might have involved artists who are quite well known, and it's quite easy to research. But this one was very different. Really, I think that over the last 10 years or so of me working with our archive, this piece, Somerset, The Year in the Life of a Field, is just something that I've periodically noticed, cropping up, with these really scant little traces, like a poster or a mention in a brochure, or kind of like a very, very sort of small number of images. Much more kind of much smaller number of archival traces than so many of other things that we've done. But the traces that it has left just struck me as being really, really intriguing. Having this particular local connection. The image that we've looked at of the performer in this sort of mysterious kind of textile box. And really, I think it was something that I thought would just be interesting to look at on, a bit of a sort of a chance, really. I was interested in this, the way that it sort of maybe gave us this opportunity to think about Arnolfini as more of a regional art centre, as well as something that was just for Bristol and, like a city context. And also, I thought the particular history of land art in England around this sort of period, sort of like 70s, 80s, having this, being something particularly interesting, I suppose. But yeah, it was a bit of a chance, I think, in sort of choosing it. But I was confident that in approaching you and sort of inviting you to sort of riff off it, respond to it, that something good would probably happen, because I knew about your interest both in land art and the fact that you're both an artist and a gardener. But given the fact that it was a very open brief with not a great deal of material initially to get your teeth stuck into, how did you approach it?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think there was a video, an interview with Lizzie Cox that you shared with me about the exhibition, and that was quite rich in content, actually, because she was being filmed in her studio where she worked, and it included shots of the field, which the field project was about. So that was quite rich and felt really exciting. The sort of potential for sort of exploring some of the things that she was talking about, because she seemed to sort of communicate that she worked in quite a long form sort of way, like she worked on the project over several years, and it began by her visiting this particular field and exploring it for a year, and just going there, just the act of going there and seeing what happened and observing what was happening throughout the year on a sort of larger and sort of zoomed in scale. So that was really intriguing. And then there was something about the colour, the use of colour in the images, like the posters for the film, that were also really intriguing. And then I guess I was interested to I was thinking, well, how do I move forward from this? This is all we have. And then you managed to get hold of her, because sadly she passed away about 10 years ago, and you managed to get hold of her husband's contact details somehow.
That's right, because at that point there was a website. Because again, we didn't know that she'd passed away, when we first started the project, and I thought it was important to try and establish some sort of connection with the family because, wanted their blessing essentially.
Yeah.
But that was it. I found Julian's email, and then I don't think I spoke to him a great deal other than that it was something that we were thinking about doing, and then just put you in touch.
Yeah. I mean, it was it could have gone so many different ways, really. That sort of quite random connection and making contact with someone in that way. But yeah, thankfully he was really sort of receptive and really delighted actually that someone was working with Lizzie's work actually. And so we had a sort of series of email exchanges, and then I had a Zoom meeting, possibly early 2021. So we were in the midst of lockdown, and I had a Zoom meeting with him and his daughter Isabel, who live in Watchet, which is nearby Nettlecombe, where the field's located in Somerset on the coast. And and before then, so I guess before we had this Zoom, they gathered some of her work to show me through the screen. And we had this really nice sort of meandering conversation for about an hour, and I was sort of asking them questions about Lizzie and about her work in general, and also about the project itself as well. And they were sort of showing me stuff, and so we had this session and just sort of left feeling like really excited. And they were just both really receptive and like delighted that someone was sort of looking at her work.
Yeah. You mentioned colour and being really interested in the use of colour, that you got a sense of from, both from the film and some of the bits and bobs in our archive. And you mentioned Julian and Isabel showing you some material, so as I understand it, Lizzie was mostly a printmaker?
Yeah, she was. So she worked in lots of different print methods and textiles, and she worked at UWE, Bauer Ashton, and she worked at London colleges as well. Mm-hmm. And her and Julian actually carried out these summer schools for years down in Watchet and Nettlecombe, where the students that she was teaching would come down for week residentials over the summer, and they would get the students to go and explore the landscape, and then come back and spend the week sort of exploring their discoveries and being quite sort of free and experimental about what they were doing. And I think that's sort of mimicking her own approach to things, really, is to not really necessarily have an idea of a starting point, just to go and explore, which is something that I do within my own work and how I approach my own work. And
that was so I think you told me about how some of those students, they'd basically be like gathering natural objects from the land and then sort of making prints with them. Yeah, so one of the things she did with these, she called them egg prints, and there's this really nice sort of bit of archive material where she writes instructions of how to make an egg print, and she means a stone print by this, but the stone is sort of replicating eggs, obviously. And so, going out into the landscape with print materials and making prints in situ. So these egg prints are gorgeous. So using a really sort of thin paper, covering the eggs and then wrapping them in paper, for example. But she also did a lot of lino printing out in nature as well, and all sorts of things like that. But yeah, she was an amazing textile artist as well, and made fantastic costumes. And I think she made costumes for bands in the 70s and stuff, these really wild sort of psychedelic costumes that are like full of colour and life. Wow. With those summer schools, one thing that I remember thinking was really interesting is when we first announced the fact that you were going to be working on this for the 60th anniversary year, quite a few people ended up getting in touch on social media saying that they'd gone to these, that they participated in these workshops, these summer schools, and it kept coming up that just people had found them really like amazing, rich, memorable experiences that I think as young artists, as young students, had just been like a real, memorable, time for them.
Yeah, I think as time went on over the year that I was working on the project, and I met more people that knew her and had more deeper conversations with her husband and daughter, it really came across that she was a really focused artist, really driven, and constantly making work, and really into process, and seemingly a brilliant teacher, really inspiring teacher.
Great. So you had these little bits and pieces from the archive. You'd met Julian and Isabel, but then when you started to think about, well, how are you actually going to translate this into some sort of like tangible response that you can then share with like our audiences. How did you go about that?
So I decided. What I've been doing for the past number of years is to mark or celebrate in some way the turnings of the seasons through the spring, the equinoxes and the solstices, and those sort of pagan events. So I decided to frame it around going to visits to the field on those days, and so my first visit was spring equinox 2021, which is just over a year ago, and so I went to find the field, which is in Nettlecombe, which is about 5 miles from Watchet, and it's a small hamlet, privately owned hamlet with a church and a really interesting sort of history. It's a sort of selection of buildings that have sort of been rented out to artists and stuff for decades. So it has this sort of rich history there, and you can sort of tell it has this sort of feeling in the place. So I went and found the field. No real idea or sort of plan of what I was going to do when I got there. But I stayed in my van, which is something that I often do as a starting point for making work and responding to place. So I just went there in the van and just sort of sat, looked, wandered around, and probably spent, an evening and good part of the next day there, just sort of exploring the place really. And I think I was trying to sort of identify where Lizzie was looking at the field from where she lived from, which was a sort of outbuilding. So I got a sense of her view into the field and what she was seeing as she walked up into it. So, and then the surrounding areas and, the people that were there as well. So my first exploration felt a bit like I didn't really know what the hell I was doing. So I guess I was just trying to sort of find traces of her and try to sort of see through her eyes, really, to sort of see what was happening in this field, because it was quite an unremarkable field. It's on an incline. I think that's probably the most sort of interesting thing about it, but essentially it was just an unfarmed field with a perimeter fence, but beautiful views out all over Somerset. And so each time I went back, I guess my sort of connection with it deepened with the place. But I think despite sort of having this intention of creating a written piece out of my experience each time I went, I didn't massively have a sense of what I would do before I went. So and that felt quite important, actually, just to sort of let the land and the experience sort of drive my approach to it on the day, and not to sort of really think too much about it. There's a word that I discovered called shul, which is a Tibetan word, and it means a mark that remains after that which is made it has passed by. So such as like footprints and memories and stories. And so I was sort of thinking about that quite a lot. It's like when I was sort of walking through the field and walking around the field, sort of thinking about the footsteps and all of the things that happened there, and how Lizzie developed this like bonkers performance out of quite an ordinary field. So all those sort of things were in my mind, really, when I was thinking about it.
Like walking in her footsteps.
Yeah, walking in her footsteps. Yeah, and also other footsteps, and other non-human footsteps, and just what this field has experienced since it's been there, which is forever potentially. And I think also for me, I So a year before this project, my grandfather, who I had a really close relationship with, had passed away. And so I was sort of experiencing quite a lot of loss and grief, and also some sort of romantic loss as well. So I sort of had that in me as well, and I think I took that into the project, probably unconsciously really, until sort of reflecting on it afterwards. But also thinking about the fact that Lizzie wasn't around anymore, and I'm trying to learn about her and discover her through the stories of others and through this place, and also trying to sort of deal with my own sort of loss as well through this project in a way, as well as a sort of connection.
That's really interesting, and it makes me think of one of the few little bits of Lizzie's writing that I had in the archive was when she was talking about the rationale for the piece, The Year of the Life of the Field, this sort of like, you know, documentation of observing a field every year, was this sort of trying to use the landscape as a way to almost like the natural optimism of seasonal change, and the fact that there's kind of like inevitability to sort of, you know, natural processes that maybe sort of can cut through some of those sorts of heavier, you know, like human emotional experiences, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, this idea of like a physical landscape out in nature, and then we have our own sort of internal landscapes as well. And is it Robert Macfarlane talks about this topography of self, which is also really interesting. So I think there was some of that going on that I've mainly only realised afterwards. But having a sort of communion with the place and with the land and with the story and with the time of year, time passing, and, you know, being able to process things and learning more things about yourself and place and Lizzie as well, I suppose. Yeah.
So you kept going back to the fields, you know, and sort of over at different stages throughout the course of the year, in a way that did sort of, you know, kind of mirror, I guess, sort of Lizzie's process over 40 years ago. But then the way that you shared that was through these blog posts, which were text, which were image, moving image, sound involved?
Only through the film.
Okay. Yes. And did you want to say anything about how you approach those?
Yeah. So I think the more I sort of got into it, the more it sort of felt like a ritual actually as well, and particularly that I was going on these sort of, you know, these significant points throughout the year. And so I think the posts, the written pieces that I created, like felt like they were standalone pieces in a way. But then I made, on the second time I went on the summer solstice, I made a short video piece that was very much about the body. So I was physically retracing the steps from where Lizzie would have walked into the field. And then I was really thinking about my own presence within this space as well. And I wrote a piece about called Earth Body, and I spent quite a lot of time sort of laying face down pretty much in the field. At which point there were loads of like lovely wildflowers everywhere, and also ants. Amazingly, Isabel and Julian, they let me go and look at all Lizzie's work, and she's got this amazing studio in the house that Julian still lives in that has been untouched since she passed away.
In Watchet?
In Watchet, and they let me spend time with all of her stuff, which felt like a real privilege. And so through doing that, I learnt more about her processes, but I also got really excited about the costumes from the original performance piece. We found them in the most immaculate condition, and they're made out of silk, and they're beautifully pressed, and they're just like absolutely divine objects. And I was really like, I want to do something with these dresses. They're incredible. And thankfully, Isabel, her daughter, was up for wearing them. So, you know, developed this nice sort of relationship with her husband and daughter, and so they were really open to my suggestions basically, and they didn't really say no to anything, which is great because they could have easily been a bit, it was quite a difficult experience for them, I think, in some way, because revisiting all this stuff. It was quite a natural process in a way, and then I started thinking I'd really like to make a film to sort of document this process and her process, and thinking about how I might do that. And I wanted to take the costumes back into the field, and in fact they'd probably never been to the field because they were in the performance. So.
Yes, but they were printed with images that were sort of reflective of the field in some sort of way. That's how Lizzie made them, wasn't she? To be worn by the performance, whoever was doing the performance. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I just forgot to add, actually, part of my thinking in visiting those periods of time was like spring, summer, autumn, and winter, because the costumes that she made were the same as well. So they were so they were each costume to mark a different season, and the costumes would be all put on top of each other and then stripped off throughout the performance. So yes, each one was like replicating a different point in the year. And there was also a really bonkers combine harvester one. It was like this sort of crazy red thing that you had to hold your arms out, and it's mad.
Wow. And then, because then I suppose you were working on these written blog posts that we were sort of releasing through the course of the 60th year, which, I suppose I was particularly struck of, this was coinciding with this, how we were trying to negotiate different lockdown restrictions and a lot of uncertainty about, how Arnolfini was going to open, and, how we could present stuff and where audiences were at and everything. But we were sort of, releasing these posts pretty much as you were producing them. But I think I had a really strong sense that we had to do something else, something more than just these blog posts. And, I guess this is when we sort of thought about the film idea, which gave you this opportunity to take the costumes to the field and work with Isabel. But again, you made that, am I right in thinking, around the winter solstice? So it's again like a kind of a continuation of the same process.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, so that was my fourth and final visit for 2021, was to go down and spend a day in the field, and then a day with Isabel in the studio filming some of Lizzie's archival work, and then we went to the field for the afternoon and sort of reenacted, in a sense, not in a direct way, but the performance. And that was an amazing experience. It felt like a ritual again. So we walked up the field from the back of the house where Lizzie would have been. And Isabel was sort of delighted, and she stood there in the freezing cold and took off all these clothes, basically, and ran around the field. It was great. Yeah, she was really up for playing with it, really, which was really lovely. Again,
this I that shawl sense of like walking back up, with the costume on. And
we just I really felt like Lizzie was really present then in that final trip to the field, with Isabel being there, and all the conversations that we'd had and what we'd been discovering together in the studio as well, sort of built to this point that that we just had this really lovely experience that felt really connected to Lizzie.
Yes, yeah. I think that really comes across when you watch the film, this sense of like the richness, whether that's through the quantity of the archival material, the slides, or all these layers of just amazing fabric. But another element to the film, which is so wonderful, of course, is the sound.
Yes, so that was amazing discovery. So rummaging through these sort of boxes and print chest drawers in Lizzie's studio, discovered a cassette of the original music from the performance that was made specifically for the performance by a musician called Stuart Gordon, I think, who sadly passed away a few years ago. but we listened to it on this really rusty old cassette player in Julian's kitchen, and it was really hard to get a sense of what it was like, but I got it digitised, and the quality is fantastic, and it's this sort of like an hour-long score essentially for the performance, and it sort of meanders from like quite bonkers 80s, early 80s sort of synth or late 70s sort of synth stuff through to sort of some quite ethereal guitar and just sort of quite atmospheric stuff.
Yes, yeah, because so the original performance had been Lizzie making the costumes and the sort of stage set, Stuart having done the soundtrack, and then there was the dancer.
Kirsty, who's still alive. I think she's going to come and see the show at some point.
Oh, fantastic.
So I've been in touch with these people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I've met lots of other people that knew Lizzie as well. So at Nettlecombe, where the field was, some people have lived there for decades, so, since the 70s, and they're all artists and, on the whole, creatives. And so I happened to sort of meet people by chance, actually, and had these really lovely, rich experiences where they would sort of give me more information about Lizzie. So I just built up quite a sort of rich idea of who she was as a person and how she ticked and stuff, which has been like really interesting to get to know someone that isn't here in that way. Like, it's quite a unique experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, also observing from the sidelines of how you were getting on over the year, it felt also like there was quite a few quite weird coincidences, wasn't there, of just sort of like people popping up, and the connection with Yui, the fact that Lizzie had taught at Yui, which is obviously someone that Arnolfini works with really, really closely nowadays, which I had no idea about that connection previously. But the strangest one of those for me was the fact that you'd actually been to the studio before by accident.
Yeah, so it was about October 2020. I'd been to the Exmoor with a friend, in inverted commas, and we just had some time to kill before he got the train, and we looked on the map and we were like, oh, there's a cider farm here, let's go and have a look at that. And we sort of drove down this lane, drove past this little church, up this track, and then we were like, oh, it doesn't feel like we should be here. And there's this sort of cluster of buildings, and it had this sort of atmosphere to it. And then all of a sudden this woman appeared, this very interested looking woman, and we had a little bit of a chat with her. We were like, what is this place? Like, it's got, you can tell that it's not just it's someone's house. And she was like, oh, it belongs to this family and they rent out bits of it to artists. I'm just doing up this space here to live in for a bit. And we left just being really curious about it, and just had that sort of sense of things happening there, like a community or commune or something. And then, so when you got in touch with me about the project, there was a certain point, quite a while afterwards, that I suddenly remembered this thing, and I looked on the map and I was like, holy shit, that's that place.
It's so bizarre.
It's so wild, yeah.
Really out in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
off the beaten track, but just been there.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Okay, great. The last thing I just wanted to talk about is, so we're currently showing the film in the Dark Studio Arnolfini, and also some text pieces that you created, and a book that you created, which are all really wonderful, sort of like extra layers, I think, to showing the piece. But also in this space, we're showing a vitrine full of work by students at Weston College. Do you want to say a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, sure. Well, I used to live in Bristol, and I've moved to Weston 3 years ago. And so you're trying to make some connections outside of the city. And so we got in touch with Weston College and said, would you be interested in doing some sessions around sort of land art and walking and art in the landscape, essentially. So I did a few sessions with students there, and we did a walk, which you came on with me. So we walked out to this place in Weston that overlooks the Somerset levels and overlooks the sea and the River Pill, and got students to engage in a series of sort of prompts, to sort of sit and look and try and experience their surroundings. And then I did a series of print workshops with them. So Lizzie used to do these beautiful monoprints of leaves and plants and flowers and stuff. So we did some of that, and some cyanotype printing, and showed them some of the sort of land art canon, and sort of talked about how landscape can affect how we experience our surroundings and how you can bring that into your own artwork. And then they went off and sort of ran with it, really. They're tutors, and they produced some really rich work, actually.
And I suppose we, after those original workshops in last November, thinking about when it sort of ended up thinking, yeah, we're definitely going to go ahead with this sort of small exhibition of the film, really wanted to include them, again, partly because I think Lizzie had this connection with teaching and with students, but also, I guess, from my point of view, wanting to sort of like add another layer to this sort of Somerset relationship. Yeah. So, so we asked the students, didn't we, to sort of, to make work that was about what does the local landscape mean to you?
Yes,
which is hence, all the work that they've done. I guess a lot about sort of the seaside. Yeah. But again, it felt really the way that they've all found ways to sort of document their experience of being in a place. I think is really really fantastic. Yeah, definitely, and nice to sort of have that connection with Lizzie being a teacher as well, and taking her students out into the landscape as well. So really sort of thinking about that when I was approaching it. Yeah. Fantastic, brilliant. Yeah, well, thanks, Phil. No, thank you for talking. And it's just felt like the whole thing has been from like I say, sort of a very minimal beginnings, but just this slight suspicion that I reckon that there's something in this, to like, a year, 18 months later, just sort of thinking that I think we've had the opportunity to find out so much about such an interesting little bit of of art that we've all sort of or most of us have probably forgotten about, and I just wanted to really thank you for the way that you've responded to it. It's just, I think it's been amazing. It's been so inspiring to watch. Thank you. I mean, it's been a total joy to work on. I think part of that is the connections that I've made with people that knew Lizzie as well. So it's been really just been a very rich, pleasant, joyful and creative experience. Yeah, and I'm hoping to do a bit more work with Isabel, her daughter, on archiving some of Lizzie's work at some point as well, and maybe doing some other things around her work. So yeah, watch this space, hopefully. Fantastic, pleased to hear it. Thanks very much, Sam. Cheers, Phil.